Commander Kethral stood at the observation deck of the warship Crimson Talon and watched. The stars drift past like scattered diamonds against black velvet. 200 years he had served the Galactic Concordance, and in that time he had seen things that would shatter the minds of lesser beings. He remembered the Krelloks, those massive armored beasts who spat acid capable of melting through starship hulls and who screamed in frequencies that liquefied internal organs from 50 meters away. He remembered the Mindweavers, those elegant serpentine creatures whose telepathic abilities could reach into an enemy's brain and simply turn off the will to live, leaving soldiers standing frozen while their hearts forgot to beat. He remembered the Obsidian Swarm, billions of silicon-based organisms no larger than a fingernail that moved through space in clouds so vast they blocked out suns, consuming everything in their path, breaking down matter at the molecular level to fuel their endless reproduction. Kethral had fought beside all of them, and he had earned the Crimson Spiral, the highest honor the Concordance could bestow upon any soldier. His scales were marked with 17 ceremonial scars, each representing a campaign that should have killed him, but somehow did not. He was old now, older than most Varathi ever lived to be. But his 4 eyes remained sharp, and his mind remained sharper when the summons came from high command. He had expected something worthy of his experience, perhaps a border conflict with one of the Outer Rim territories, or maybe a suppression operation against the pirate clans that had been growing bold in recent months. Instead, they gave him this humans, the High Admiral had said, her mandibles clicking with what might have been amusement. A new species recently admitted to the Concordance after their homeworld made first contact 17 cycles ago, and they have been granted provisional military integration status. Kethral had accessed the files on his neural link and found himself deeply unimpressed. The humans came from a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in an Mastar, unremarkable arm of an unremarkable galaxy. They were bipedal, warm-blooded, soft-skinned creatures covered in patches of thin hair. They possessed no natural weapons worth mentioning, and no claws or fangs or venom glands or acid sacs. Their strength was average, and their speed was average, and their reflexes were average. They could not see beyond the visible spectrum, and they could not hear beyond a narrow range of frequencies, and they possessed no psychic abilities whatsoever. In short, they were absolutely ordinary in every measurable way. You want me to integrate them into my unit, Kethral had said, and it was not a question, a diplomatic necessity, the High Admiral replied. The humans are eager to prove themselves, and we need experienced commanders to evaluate their potential, and your record speaks for itself. Kethral understood what this really meant: babysitting duty, a way to ease him toward retirement without the dishonor of simply removing him from active service. He accepted the assignment because refusing would accomplish nothing, and because 2 centuries of military service had taught him to recognize battles worth fighting. This was not one of them. The human contingent arrived 3 days later aboard a small transport vessel that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and optimistic prayers. Kethral watched them disembark, with his senior officers flanking him, and he made no effort to hide his skepticism. There were 12 of them in total, wearing armor that seemed almost primitive compared to Concordance standard issue. Their leader was a female called Sergeant Chun, a compact creature with dark hair pulled back from her face and eyes that seemed to hold entirely too much awareness for such a young species. Commander Kethral, she said, and her pronunciation of his name was surprisingly accurate. Sergeant Maya Chun of the Terran Expeditionary Force, and we are honored to serve under your command. She extended her hand in what Kethral had learned was a human greeting ritual, and he grasped it briefly. noting the calluses on her palm and the steadiness of her grip. "You and your soldiers are welcome aboard the Crimson Talon," he replied. "Following protocol, my adjutant will show you to your quarters, and we will begin integration exercises at first light tomorrow." Chun nodded, and there was something in her expression that Kethrol could not quite read. Not nervousness, certainly, and not the overconfidence he had expected from a young species eager to prove itself. It was something else, something patient and watchful. Like a predator settling into tall grass, he dismissed the impression as imagination over the following weeks. Kethrol observed the humans during training, exercises, and found his initial assessment largely confirmed they were competent enough in their way, but nothing exceptional. They handled their weapons adequately, and they followed orders without complaint, and they maintained their equipment with admirable dedication, but they tired easily, requiring something called sleep for nearly a third of each day cycle. And they consumed truly alarming quantities of food and water to maintain their biological functions. They also smiled constantly, which Kethrol found deeply unsettling among the Varathi. Baring teeth was a threat display, a warning of imminent violence. But humans seemed to do it whenever they were pleased or amused, or sometimes for no apparent reason at all. One of them, a large male called Morrison, actually smiled while doing physical exercises that left him gasping and drenched in fluid his body apparently excreted to regulate temperature. It was bizarre. Kethrol began to suspect that humans might be slightly insane as a species. But he kept this observation out of his official reports. 6 weeks into the integration period, orders came down from High Command, a routine mission. They said an abandoned research station on a small moon designated as Hollow in the Terra system intelligence suggested the presence of scavengers. Perhaps a few dozen pirates who had taken up residence in the empty facility. Kethrol was to take a combined force, clear the station, and secure any valuable equipment or data that remained. It would be an excellent opportunity for the humans to gain real combat experience in a low-risk environment. Kethrol assembled his team with care and selected 40 of his best Varathi soldiers, along with 8 Kroax heavy assault specialists. To provide firepower, the 12 humans would serve as support personnel, handling logistics and communications, while the real soldiers did the dangerous work. Sergeant Chun accepted this arrangement without complaint, though something flickered behind her eyes that Kethrol once again could not identify. 3 days later, they made planetfall on Hollow Moon. The station rose from the gray dust like the skeleton of some ancient beast, all sharp angles and dark windows and corridors that led into shadow. Kethrol felt the first stirring of unease as his soldiers spread out to secure the perimeter. Something was wrong here. The silence was too complete, too heavy, like the quiet that fell over a forest when a predator passed through. He was about to order a full retreat and request orbital scans when the ground beneath them erupted and everything changed forever. They came from everywhere at once, tunnels that had been invisible moments before split open across the dusty surface, and figures poured out like water from a broken dam. Kethrol's combat instincts took over before his conscious mind could process what he was seeing, and he was already firing, already shouting orders, already pulling his soldiers into defensive formation. But even as he fought, part of his brain was screaming that this was impossible. Intelligence had said a few dozen pirates. There were thousands of them. The creatures that swarmed toward his position were barely recognizable as living beings anymore. Once they might have been members of various concordant species, but something had twisted them into nightmares. Extra limbs sprouted from backs and shoulders at unnatural angles, and eyes had multiplied across faces in patterns that made no biological sense. Some of them had mouths where mouths should not be, splitting open in their chests or their palms, all filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. The devourer cult Cathrall had heard stories, whispers really, of a religious movement that worshipped entropy and decay, that modified their bodies with forbidden biotech in pursuit of some twisted idea of perfection. He had always assumed the stories were exaggerated. They were. Not his Krelok soldiers unleashed their acid sprays in the front ranks of attackers, dissolved into screaming puddles of organic slurry. But more came to take their place. His Varati troops formed a firing line that cut down dozens with each volley. But the cultists kept coming, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades without hesitation. There was something wrong with their eyes. Cathrall noticed in the chaos. They were blank, empty, like windows into rooms where nobody lived anymore. Whatever process had transformed their bodies had done something to their minds as well, burning away fear and self-preservation and leaving only hunger. Within the first hour, Cathrall lost 6 Varathi soldiers and 2 Kreloks. They retreated into the research station, sealing blast doors behind them. And for a moment there was silence. Then the pounding started. The cultists threw themselves against the doors with no regard for their own bodies. And Cathrall could hear bones breaking with each impact, could hear the wet sounds of flesh tearing against metal. They did not stop. They did not even slow down. Commander Sergeant Chun appeared at his side, her human face spattered with something dark. We need to establish a secure perimeter inside the station and find a defensible position. Cathrall looked at her with something approaching respect. Most soldiers, upon encountering their first real combat, showed signs of panic or at least heightened stress. Chun's heart rate was elevated. He could see the pulse jumping in her neck. But her voice was steady and her suggestions were tactically sound. Agreed, he said. We will fall back to the central command hub, and the blast doors there are rated for ship-to-ship weapons and should hold longer. They moved through the station in careful formation, clearing each corridor before advancing. The facility was larger than initial scans had suggested. A maze of laboratories and storage areas and living quarters that had clearly been abandoned in haste. Personal effects littered the floors, and meals sat rotting on tables, and in one room they found a child's toy. A small stuffed creature that Cathrall did not recognize. He did not want to think about what had happened to the station's original inhabitants. They reached the command hub without further casualties and sealed themselves. Inside, the space was large enough to accommodate their remaining forces, with multiple exits that could be defended and access to the stations still functioning. Life support systems water would not be a problem, and the air recyclers were operational food. However, was another matter. Cathrall took inventory, and his heart sank. They had supplies for perhaps 5 days at normal consumption rates. Maybe 7 if they rationed strictly. The Kreloks would run out of acid reserves in 2 days at most, and the Varathi ammunition would last perhaps 3. Communications were jammed. Something the cultists had brought was broadcasting interference across all frequencies, and no signal could penetrate the static. They could not call for reinforcements. They could not request evacuation. They were alone on the first night. The cultists breached the outer perimeter. They had found another way in, crawling through ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels, and they fell upon a Varathi patrol with shrieking fury. Cathrall lost 4 more soldiers before they could seal the breach. The humans fought in that engagement, and Chun's squad accounted for 11 cultist kills with no casualties of their own. Cathrall noted this with surprise but attributed it to luck. On the second day, they discovered the cultists had cut the power conduits to the water recyclers. A team had to venture out to make repairs, and they walked into an ambush. 3 more Varathi died, and one of the Kreloks took a wound that left it unable to spray acid. The humans volunteered for the next repair mission. Cathrall almost refused. But Chen pointed out that her soldiers were the most expendable. In terms of combat value, and losing them would not significantly impact their defensive capabilities. The logic was cold. But Sound and Kethril approved the mission. The humans went out and the humans came back. They had completed repairs and killed 37 cultists, and not one of them had received so much as a scratch. Private Morrison was smiling when he returned. That unsettling display of teeth that Kethril still could not interpret. There was blood on his armor that was not his own, and his eyes held something that might have been joy by the third day. Supplies were critical, and morale was crumbling. The Krelloks had exhausted their acid completely, and were reduced to fighting with their claws. Half the Varathi were wounded, and their ammunition was nearly spent. The cultists attacked in waves, seemingly endless, and each wave cost Kethril soldiers he could not afford to lose. He gathered his officers for what he knew would be a final briefing. "We cannot hold this position much longer," he said, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "By tomorrow at the latest, they will overwhelm us, and I want every soldier to understand what we face." The Varathi accepted this with grim dignity. Death in battle was an honorable end, and they would make the enemy pay dearly for every life taken. The Krelloks rumbled their agreement, already sharpening their claws for the final fight. Then Sergeant Chun stepped forward. "Permission to speak." "Commander," Kethril gestured for her to continue, expecting perhaps a request to send a final message to loved ones or some other human ritual of farewell. Instead, Chun said, "We have a plan." Kethril stared at her. "A plan," he repeated. "Yes, sir," Chen replied. And that strange something flickered behind her eyes again. "We've been watching, and we've been thinking, and we believe we can break the siege." One of the Varathi officers laughed. A harsh barking sound. 12 soft-skinned creatures are going to defeat an army that is overwhelmed. 60 veteran soldiers. Chun turned to look at him, and the Varathi's laughter died in his throat. "With respect, Lieutenant," she said quietly, "you've been fighting like soldiers, and soldiers follow rules and expect their enemies to follow rules." She paused, and her smile was nothing like the warm expressions Kethril had seen during training. This smile had teeth. "We're going to fight like humans." Kethril agreed to Chun's plan because he had no better options, and because dying while attempting something was preferable to dying while waiting for the end. He did not expect the plan to work. He did not expect to survive the night. He certainly did not expect what happened next. The first thing the humans did was stop sleeping. When Kethril pointed out that biological organisms required rest to function, Chen simply shrugged and pulled a small container from her pack. "Stimulants," she explained, shaking several small pills into her palm. "Military grade and enough to keep us functional for 72 hours. Maybe longer if we push it." The side effects, Kethril began. Paranoia, heart palpitations, possible hallucinations, long-term neural damage, Chun recited, swallowing the pills dry. "We know and we don't care." She passed the container to her squad, and every single one of them took the pills without hesitation. Then they brewed something they called coffee, a bitter black liquid that smelled like it could strip paint from metal, and they drank it by the liter by hour 6. Private Morrison had been awake for 30 standard hours by hour 12. None of the humans had rested at all. They should have been collapsing from exhaustion. But instead, they seemed sharper, more focused, as if the deprivation was honing them into something harder and more dangerous. Kethril watched them with growing unease as they prepared for the first phase of what Chun called Operation Nightmare. The plan was simple in concept and insane in execution. Instead of defending and waiting for the enemy to come to them, the humans would go out into the station and hunt. "They expect us to be prey," Chun explained, spreading a rough map of the facility across a table. "They have numbers, and they have time, and they think they just need to keep pushing until we break, and that's how predators think about prey." She tapped the map. We're going to teach them that they're wrong about what we are. The humans moved out in pairs, slipping through ventilation shafts and maintenance corridors that the cultists had not yet discovered. They carried their standard weapons, but they also carried knives, lengths of wire, and improvised devices that Corporal Jang had assembled. From materials scavenged throughout the station, Jang was a small woman with steady hands and a gentle voice. And she had spent the past day building bombs out of cleaning chemicals, fertilizer from the station's hydroponic gardens, and components stripped from broken equipment. When Kethril asked how she knew to make such things, she explained that humans had been killing each other for thousands of years before they ever reached the stars. We're very good at it, she said, and she sounded almost apologetic, finding new ways to hurt each other, and it's practically an art form on our world. The first explosion came 2 hours after the humans left the command hub. It was distant, somewhere in the station's lower levels, and it was followed by screaming that cut off abruptly, then silence. The second explosion came 30 minutes later, closer this time, and Kethril felt the floor shake beneath his feet. More screaming, more silence. The pattern continued through the night. Explosions would sound, sometimes single blasts and sometimes chains of them rippling through the corridors like thunder. Screams would follow, always from the cultists, never from the humans, and then silence, heavy and oppressive, filled with anticipation of the next attack by morning. Chun's squad had killed over 300 cultists. They returned to the command hub to resupply, and Kethril saw something had changed in them. They were covered in blood and dirt and worse things, and their eyes held a light that made even. The battle-hardened Varathi stepped back. Private Morrison had taken a cultist blade through his shoulder during a close-quarters engagement. The wound was deep, clearly serious, and would have earned any Varathi soldier a medical discharge and immediate treatment. Morrison had pulled the blade out himself, cauterized the wound with a plasma torch from his emergency kit, and returned to fighting when one of the Varathi medics expressed horror at this. Morrison seemed genuinely confused. "It's just pain," he said, flexing his damaged shoulder to test its range of motion. "Pain doesn't actually hurt you, and it's just your body sending signals, and you can choose to ignore signals." He smiled that terrible smile. "I've decided to ignore it." The second phase began as the cultists started to realize something had changed. They had expected desperate prey, cornered and waiting to die. Instead, they found hunters in their midst, shadows that struck without warning and vanished without trace. Chun's squad began leaving bodies arranged as messages. Cultists found their fallen comrades hanging from ceiling fixtures, posed in positions of supplication toward the command hub. They found them stacked in neat piles at intersections, each body bearing a single wound, perfectly placed for maximum efficiency. They found them with their extra eyes removed, their modified limbs cut away, reduced to something almost normal in death. The psychological effect was devastating. These were creatures that worshipped death and decay, that had mutilated their own bodies in pursuit of some twisted transcendence. They were not supposed to feel fear, but fear is a universal constant, and the humans knew exactly how to cultivate it. By the fourth day, Kethril's scouts reported something unprecedented. The cultists were retreating. They were pulling back from large sections of the station, consolidating their forces in defensible positions, and setting guards at every entrance and exit. They were afraid. Kethril found Chun in one of the side chambers, cleaning her weapons with mechanical precision. She had not slept in over 80 hours, and her hands were rock steady. "How are you doing this?" he asked, and it was not entirely a question. Chun looked up at him, and her eyes were red-rimmed but alert. "We're persistent predators, Commander," she said. "Back on our homeworld, before we had technology, we used to hunt by following prey, until it collapsed from exhaustion, and we would track an animal for days, never letting it rest, never letting it feel safe, until finally it just stopped running." She returned to cleaning her weapon. "We evolved to be the thing that never stops coming, and it's in our blood and our bones and the way our brains are wired." She paused. The cultists thought they were predators because they have claws and extra limbs and they don't fear death. But that's not what makes a predator. Her voice dropped. Predator is the thing that never stops and never gives up and never lets you rest until you're too tired to run anymore. She looked at Kethral, and he saw 200,000 years of evolutionary pressure staring back at him. "We're not trapped in here with them, Commander, and they're trapped in here with us." On the 5th day, Chun outlined the final phase of Operation Nightmare. They had broken the enemy's spirit, but the cultists still held the communications array that was jamming their signals. As long as that array functioned, no help could reach them. Someone would have to destroy it. Private Okonkwo volunteered. He was a quiet man who rarely spoke and who always seemed to be smiling at some private joke when he raised his hand. The other humans nodded as if they had expected this. "I can get close enough to plant charges," he said. "Their defenses are oriented outward, and they're not expecting an attack from inside their perimeter. The explosion will kill you." Kethral said. Okonkwo shrugged. "Probably," he agreed. "But it will also kill their command structure and destroy the jamming equipment and give the rest of you a chance." Kethral stared at him. "You would die for strangers and for people you've known for less than 2 months." Okonkwo's smile widened. "Commander, humans have been dying for strangers since we figured out how to sharpen rocks. And my grandmother died protecting people she'd never met. And her father died in a war fighting for an idea. And his mother died making sure her children could escape. A disaster." He touched something hanging around his neck. A small metal disc on a chain. "We're all going to die someday, and the only thing we get to choose is what we die for. And this seems like a good enough reason to me." He left that night, slipping through the cultist lines like a ghost. 6 hours later, the jamming stopped. The explosion was visible from the command hub, a pillar of fire that rose through the station's damaged hull and reached toward the stars. When rescue ships arrived 2 hours later, they found Kethral's combined force battered. But alive they found over 2,000 dead cultists, and they found the remains of Private Okonkwo, still clutching the detonator. Surrounded by the bodies of the enemy leadership he had taken with him, he was still smiling. The rescue fleet descended on Hollow Moon like angels of mercy, their ships cutting through the thin atmosphere in formations that spoke of overwhelming military power. Admiral Vethkai herself commanded the lead vessel, and she had brought enough firepower to glass the entire moon if necessary. She had expected to find bodies. She had expected to recover dog tags and final messages and perhaps a few survivors clinging to life in some forgotten corner of the station. Instead, she found Commander Kethral standing at the landing zone with his remaining soldiers arranged in formal greeting formation. They were bloody and exhausted, and some of them could barely stand. But they were alive. Vethkai's mandibles clicked in shock as she disembarked. "Commander," she said, her eyes sweeping across the battered troops. "We intercepted fragments of your initial distress call before jamming cut you off. And intelligence suggested you were facing a force of several thousand hostiles." "That is correct, Admiral. Our scans show approximately 2,000 enemy casualties scattered throughout the station." "That is also correct, Admiral." Vethkai stared at him. "You had 60 soldiers. I had 48 Varathi. 8 Krelloks and 12 humans," Kethral replied. And something in his voice made the Admiral pause. "We lost 11 Varathi, 2 Krelloks, and 1 human." "1 human. Private First Class Okonkwo," Kethral said. And his voice carried a weight that Vethkai did not understand. "He destroyed the enemy command center and communications array. And he did so knowing he would not survive." Medical teams swarmed around the survivors, checking injuries and administering treatment. Vethkai watched the human squad with growing curiosity. 3 of them bore wounds that would have incapacitated most species. Morrison's shoulder was wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, and he moved with obvious pain. But he refused evacuation until his squadmates had been checked. First, a woman named Rodriguez had taken shrapnel across her back during one of the Carter engagements, and the wounds were still seeping through her. Makeshift dressings. Another soldier, barely more than a child by human standards, had lost 2 fingers on his left hand during close-quarters combat with a cultist. He was joking with his squad mates about learning to count in base 8. These creatures should have been broken. 5 days of siege, constant combat, dwindling supplies, and losses that would have shattered veteran units, but they stood together, supporting each other, and when Sergeant Chun gathered them for a head count, they formed up with the precision of soldiers who had been fighting together for years. Rather than weeks, Catherall found Chun standing alone at the edge of the landing zone, staring at the stars. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, deep shadows carved beneath her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly from stimulant withdrawal, but her back was straight and her gaze was clear. "Sergeant," Catherall said. Approaching carefully, Chun did not turn. "We're processing Okonkwo's personal effects," she said quietly. He had letters written for his family and photos of his daughter, and a recipe for something his grandmother used to make. She was quiet for a moment. "He was going to teach me how to cook it when we got back to base." Catherall had seen death before, had lost soldiers and friends and people he cared about over 2 centuries of warfare. He knew the weight of grief, the hollow feeling that came when someone who had been alive and present was suddenly and permanently gone. But he had never quite understood sacrifice. Not truly. The Varathi honored those who fell in battle, but they did not seek death. They fought to survive, to protect their own. To preserve their people. Dying was acceptable only when living was no longer possible. Okonkwo had chosen differently. He had looked at the situation, weighed the options, and decided that his death would be more valuable than his life. Not in a moment of desperation, not in the heat of combat, but calmly, deliberately, with full knowledge of what he was doing. "I do not understand," Catherall said finally. "How can a being sacrifice themselves so willingly for others? And how can they face death with such calm?" Chun was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was tired but steady. "Commander, do you know what we call that back home?" Catherall shook his head. "We call it love," Chun said simply. "Not the romantic kind, not exactly, but something deeper. And it's the thing that makes you look at another person and decide that their survival matters more than your own." She turned to face him, and her eyes held something ancient and fierce. Okonkwo loved his squad, and he loved his family. And he loved the idea that somewhere out there his daughter would grow up in a galaxy where the good guys won. Her voice hardened. "That's not monstrous, Commander, and the monsters we fought, the Krelloks and the Mindweavers and all the rest, they killed to survive, to feed, to protect their territory, and that's instinct. And that's biology." She gestured toward her surviving squad members. "Humans kill for ideas. And we kill for people we've never met. And we kill for futures we'll never see. And we do it because we decided that something matters more than our own existence." She paused, and her smile was sad and proud and terrible all at once. "That's not being a monster. And that's being something else entirely." Catherall thought about this for a long time. He thought about the Krelloks, fearsome predators who dissolved their enemies alive, but who would not fight when victory seemed unlikely. He thought about the Mindweavers, elegant manipulators who could drive armies mad, but who retreated at the first sign of serious resistance. He thought about the Obsidian Swarm, countless and relentless, but utterly predictable in their behavior patterns. All of them were dangerous. All of them were powerful. All of them had limits, built into their very nature. Boundaries that defined what they would and would not do. Humans had no such boundaries. The only limit on human behavior was what they decided mattered. And once a human decided something mattered, they became something the galaxy had never seen before. Sergeant, Catherall said slowly, when the Concordance first made contact with your species, our analysts classified you as a low-threat civilization. And your technology was primitive, your military experience limited, and your physical capabilities unremarkable. Chun's expression did not change. I have served the Concordance for 200 years, Catherall continued. I have fought beside the most dangerous species in known space, and I have earned honors that most soldiers only dream of. He met her eyes. I have never been more afraid of anything than I am of your people. Chun smiled, and for the first time since Okonkwo's death, the expression reached her eyes. That's probably smart. Commander, she looked up at the stars again, back on our homeworld. We have a saying, and it goes, be polite, be professional, but have a plan to kill everyone you meet. Catherall felt his scales prickle. Is that a threat? No, sir, Chun replied, turning back to face him. It's a promise. And as long as you're on our side, you never have to worry about what we're capable of, because everything we can do, we will do for you. Her voice softened. That's the other side of what I was talking about. And the same thing that makes us willing to die for each other makes us willing to kill for each other. And there's no limit to either one. She extended her hand. That human greeting ritual that suddenly meant so much more than diplomatic courtesy. We're going to be good allies, Commander. And the best the Concordance has ever had. Catherall took her hand, and for the first time in 200 years, he felt something he had almost forgotten, hope. 3 months had passed since the siege of Hollow Moon. Catherall stood in the great chamber of the Concordance Military Council, surrounded by the most powerful military minds of 17 different species. The room was vast, designed to accommodate beings of all sizes and environmental requirements. The Krellox delegation sat in reinforced chairs, capable of supporting their massive armored forms. The Mineweaver representative floated in a suspension field that kept their serpentine body comfortable. A containment vessel held a fragment of the obsidian swarm, linked to the hive mind through quantum entanglement, and in the gallery above, observers from dozens of other species watched with varying degrees of interest and boredom. This was routine. After all, species assessments happened every few decades, and they rarely produced anything surprising. High Admiral Vethkai called the session to order. Commander Catherall, you have been tasked with the integration and evaluation of the species designated as humanity, and you have submitted a 300-page report detailing your experiences and recommendations. She clicked her mandibles. The Council has reviewed your report, and we have some questions. Catherall stood at attention. I am prepared to answer. Admiral, your report recommends full military integration at the highest levels. And this is unusual for a species with such limited combat capabilities. So please explain your reasoning. Catherall took a breath. Honored Council, I have served the Concordance for 200 years. And in that time, I have fought beside nearly every combat-capable species in our alliance. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled delegates. I have fought alongside the Krellox, whose acid and dissolve starship armor and whose battle cries shatter bone. The Krellox delegation rumbled with satisfaction. I have fought alongside the Mindweavers, whose telepathic abilities can drive entire armies to madness. The Mineweaver representative rippled with acknowledgement. I have fought alongside the Obsidian Swarm, who number in the billions and can consume planets. The containment vessel pulsed briefly. All of these species are formidable, and all of them have earned their place in our military structure through demonstrated excellence in warfare. Catherall paused again. The humans are not strong, and they are not fast, and may possess no natural weapons worth mentioning. And their technology is decades behind Concordance standard. and their combat experience is limited to conflicts among themselves. One of the council members, a Vorathi general with ceremonial scars covering half his face, leaned forward. Then why do you recommend elevating them above species who have proven themselves over centuries? Kethral turned to face him directly. Because the humans are the most dangerous species I have ever encountered. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The Krulok's delegation rumbled. With what might have been laughter, the Mindweaver's thoughts brushed against Kethral's mind. Probing for deception. I do not make this claim lightly, Kethral continued. I have reviewed my experiences on Hollow Moon many times, and I have consulted with the surviving members of my unit. And I have studied human history and psychology extensively since our return. He activated his neural link, projecting a holographic display in the center of the chamber during the siege. My combined force of 60 soldiers faced approximately 2,000 members of the Devour cult. And these were not ordinary enemies, and they were fanatics enhanced with Forbidden's biotech. Beings who had sacrificed their sanity and their bodies in pursuit of transcendence. The display showed tactical recordings from the battle. By conventional military doctrine, we should have been overwhelmed within 48 hours. And our supplies were limited, our communications were jammed, and we were outnumbered more than 30-1. He changed the display. Instead, we survived for 5 days and killed over 2,000 enemies while suffering minimal casualties. And this outcome was not the result of superior firepower or tactical advantage. Kethral looked at the council. It was the result of 12 humans, more murmurs, more skepticism. The scarred Vorathi general clicked his teeth. You expect us to believe that 12 soft-bodied creatures turned the tide of a battle against 2,000 enhanced fanatics? No, Kethral replied calmly. I expect you to believe the evidence. He played the recordings. The council watched in silence as the humans moved through the station, methodical and merciless. They watched Morrison pull a blade from his own shoulder and return to fighting. They watched Jang build explosives from cleaning supplies and fertilizer. They watched the psychological warfare campaign. The bodies left as warnings, the hunting parties that tracked cultists through dark corridors. They watched beings who worshipped death begin to fear it, and they watched Okonkwo walk calmly into the enemy's stronghold, knowing he would not return and detonate himself along with the cult leadership when the recordings ended. The chamber was silent. Kethral let the silence stretch. The humans possess an adaptation that I have struggled to name, he said finally. They call it different things: spite, stubbornness, determination. And I believe the most accurate term is simply refusal. We looked at each council member in turn. When faced with impossible odds, when confronted with certain death, most species experience a breaking point. And it is hardwired into our biology. A survival mechanism that tells us when to flee, when to surrender, when to accept defeat. His voice dropped. Humans do not have this breaking point. The Mindweaver representative stirred. All beings have limits. Commander, and even humans require rest, require sustenance, require physical resources to continue functioning. That is correct, Kethral agreed. But you misunderstand me, and I am not saying humans are physically unlimited. And I am saying they are psychologically unlimited. He called up another display. This one showing human historical records in their past. Humans have endured conditions that would break any species in this chamber. And they have survived ice ages and famines and plagues that killed half their population. And they have fought wars that lasted generations. Wars where entire civilizations were destroyed. The display showed images that made even the Krulok shift uncomfortably. They have inflicted horrors upon each other that defy comprehension. And they have also shown capacity for cooperation and sacrifice that equally defies comprehension. Kethral dismissed the display. The key to understanding humans is recognizing that they are not limited by instinct. And they are not limited by biology. And they are not limited by anything except what they decide matters. He paused. When a human decides something matters, truly matters, they become something the galaxy has never seen. And they will ignore pain, and they will ignore exhaustion. And they will ignore the certainty of death itself. He thought of Okonkwo, smiling as he walked toward his end. They will sacrifice everything. Not because they have no choice, but because they choose to. And that is the difference between humans and every other species I've encountered. Kethril straightened. Monsters are dangerous because of what they are. And the Krelloks are dangerous because they have acid and armor and strength. And the Mindweavers are dangerous because they have telepathy. And the Swarm is dangerous because they have numbers. He looked at the council. Humans are dangerous because of what they decide to be. And there is no upper limit on what a human can become when they have decided something is worth dying for. The chamber remained silent. I recommend full military integration at the highest levels. Kethril concluded, not because the humans need us. And their species survived for hundreds of thousands of years before they knew the concordance existed. He took a breath. I recommend integration because we need them. And because their capacity for loyalty and sacrifice and sheer bloody-minded determination is exactly what this alliance requires. He paused one final time, and because I would rather have them as allies than ever, for any reason, give them cause to become our enemies. High Admiral Vethkai's mandibles clicked slowly. You paint a compelling picture, Commander, and the Council will take your recommendations under advisement. She looked at the other delegates. Are there any final questions? The scarred Marathi general raised his hand. Commander, in your report you mentioned that you have become close with the human squad during your shared experiences. And some might suggest this has colored your judgment. Kethril considered this. General, I have served the Concordance my entire adult life. And I have earned the Crimson Spiral and 17 ceremonial scars. And my loyalty to our alliance has never been questioned. He met the general's eyes. I am not recommending integration because I care about the humans. And I am recommending it because I have seen what they can do. And the thought of facing that as an enemy keeps me awake at night. He smiled. A Vorathi expression that showed far too many teeth. I believe that is the opposite of clouded judgment. The general nodded slowly. I have no further questions. 3 weeks later, the Council announced its decision humanity was granted full military integration status. The fastest advancement in Concorn's history, Sergeant. Chun was promoted to captain and given command of a mixed-species Special Operations Unit Morrison. Rodriguez and the others received commendations and offers of advanced training.